Hey, deserving listeners, 90-Day Fiancé. Let's watch.
But Oussama, why were you trying to contact her so many times if you say you don't love her?
Just, to explain to her that, we have to end this and, there is no more future for us. Just to make things clear.
I'm sorry. Things were clear before you tried to make the phone calls.
How many times can he lie in, 5 minutes?
Yeah, the more we see from Oussama, the more it looks like he didn't really love Debbie and he was only in it for the visa, which I don't think I predicted in the beginning. It didn't look that way. I don't usually think that about the folks on the show anyway, unless there's clear evidence of it. And even then, I'm like, it's hard to know, because they could also love and want the visa anyway. But yeah, I don't know. It's possible that Oussama did love Debbie and wanted a visa, maybe a 60-40% kind of a thing. He wanted a visa more than he loved Debbie. And now that he no longer loves Debbie, he still wants the visa. So, the way it looks like he might not have ever loved Debbie, and that now that it's over and they have no relationship anymore, he is continuing to try to engage with her. Debbie's not answering his communications. And it looks like Oussama is just trying to re-engage so that he can get a visa. If he truly loved her, it just would have looked a lot different, right? He would have said, the same thing happened to Johan and Danielle. Danielle and Johan had made a plan that he was going to come back to the States, and then she goes down there and says, I'm not going to do it. And it's similar in that he did turn on her, but the way that it looked to me was that he was like, oh, well, that sucks. And okay, so it seemed like he did love Danielle, did want to be with her, and was trying to make it work. Because that first stint in Dominican Republic, it was more her that was being, at least in the edit, being the more aggravating presence. And then she goes back to the States. And then when she comes back, then he was more aggravating, because I think he was really hurt by the first stint. So, you just imagine that if Oussama at least had enough love for Debbie, the way that Johan did for Danielle, you would imagine that Oussama, upon learning, so I guess we're stuck in Morocco and we're not going to the States. Well, that's a big bummer for me, but I love Debbie and I guess let's try to make this work. Or maybe I can convince her over time, maybe in a few years or something. So Oussama didn't do that though, right? And yeah, so now he's badgering her to try to suck her back in or something. Yikes.
Who makes phone calls to tell somebody it's over when they're not taking your calls?
Me, Oussama, can do this.
Yeah, the way he comes across, it's just so awkward and weird. I wonder what's going on with him. I kind of worry about him, honestly. It's sad. I can't imagine after this show things are going to go well for him. I don't think things have gone well for him his entire life. Even though Debbie is a character, I think she actually, and she even said this, she said that she has a temptation to just never date again, but she's not going to let Oussama win, and she's going to get back on the donkey, if you will. And so he's just so odd. And now I'll hold out for the possibility that he can't communicate this effectively, but he is looking for closure. There's a 5% chance that he did love Debbie and is just so awkward and so strained in his emotional expression and so confused about how to communicate when he's under social distress that he did love her and is still wanting closure. And so he is calling her, maybe also wanting to re-engage to come to the States, but also feels, because Debbie did end it fairly quickly. I think it was healthy. It looks like it was a healthy choice. But people don't typically do that. I've worked with clients before, and I was, talking before about how most people in Debbie's shoes, especially on the show, but I think in life as well, would have hung on longer, even though a lot of data is pointing in a particular direction, right? And so I think if Debbie had reacted more normally and strung it out a little longer, there would have been perhaps more closure. So what I'm saying is that I've worked with clients where maybe a couple or an individual where the Debbies will quickly shift their paradigm and start the grieving process. The acceptance is earlier than what other people would have. And so then the person, the Oussamas, the people who were being the jerk face or the people who were indicating, so I'll make up a fictional story of a typical kind of client I would work with where, let's say it's a couple and we're working overtime and things don't work out, and one person has been falling out of love for a long time, maybe even before coming into my office. And at some point, they just level with their partner in office or out of office. Look, I'm not in love with you anymore. I'm trying to make it work, but I can't recover from that event that happened, or our incompatibilities are too great, or we fight too much or something. I just don't feel it anymore. I just don't want to be with you anymore. And so for this person, they often have to, the thing that I say is like, for the person breaking up, they've been adjusting for months usually. So by the time they say something, they will have overcome a lot of the barriers. They will have passed a lot of milestones in terms of the adjustments internally. This person who's being dumped usually has not had any of those milestones, has not crossed any of those barriers. And so for this person, their process begins when they're being told, whereas this person, it's almost like they're midstream in the process or at the end. And so what'll happen is that the person breaking up will, a week later, this person is still reeling, right? The person who got dumped is still like, I don't understand. How come we can't get back to? And this person, the person dumping, often will say, I don't understand why it's taking you so long to adjust. Or, a couple months later, I don't understand why it's taking you so long to adjust, because the breaker-upper has, because they've been internal and talking with friends or therapists or whatever, they have made those adjustments. And so if you can, and you're not being abused, if you are the breaker-upper, you want to account for that and give the person who's being dumped time to adjust and to see it that way, and maybe compassionately be with them as they do that, if that is healthy and it makes sense. So what I will see is that in some couples, the breaker-upper will indicate that it's over, but it's not like definitive, or usually it almost never is, especially in long-term relationships, just like it's over, clean cut, I'm never talking to you again. It almost never works out that way, especially in long-term relationships when you have kids and you live together and you own a house together and da-da-da. So the person who's being dumped, every once in a while, pretty rare, maybe 1 in 20 times, this person would adjust very quickly. Not because they weren't in love, but that might be kind of a factor, but because some people, like Debbie, they differentiate. They're like, okay, I have impulses to try to convince this person, let's work on it. How come that? But they differentiate enough and they look at what the person is saying. And they might even ask some questions just like, so, and Debbie even did this with Oussama. And it's clear, even though there's an impulse to hold on and to try to convince, that the things being said by the breaker-upper are so definitive and so unlikely to change that this person, even though they want to and they have an impulse to do this, and you'll often hear me say this, it's normal to try to do that, like, let's work on it. How come, or you didn't give it enough of a shot, and, they'll, I'll change. And it's just like, it's over. So they don't do that, but they very quickly, they're just like, oh, so what'll happen to the breaker-upper sometimes, even though, so this person's like, oh, okay, well, that sucks. Now I begin my grieving process, and I'm not going to really do it with you because that doesn't make any sense for me to be in contact with. And they just move on. Now, the person being dumped will be experience a lot of grief, a lot of pain, but they just don't really, because they differentiate, they don't go back to the source to try to engage with it, and they find their own people. This person, this is my whole point, will sometimes feel like, well, wait, how come? Because they wanted some closure or talk. So they were ready. They had crossed a lot of milestones, but not all of them. And so for this person, sometimes even so for the person being dumped is like, okay, I'm gone. And the breakup is like, hey, I thought, and it's weird, right? Because it's like, well, I broke up with you, but I still want to engage. And it doesn't work that way. You said your piece, and there were some conversations, and then, you don't have the right to do that. You can ask for sure, but there's no expectation there, and there can be this unmet closure need. It could be that. It probably isn't, but I'll allow for that.
You mess with somebody's mama. You don't do that. You in my world now. And you lucky you ain't here.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it's okay to threaten violence. I don't think it calls for that. Essentially, it was what he's doing. It stands to reason that Julian would do that. That's within his seeming nature. But, okay. Yeah, you're in my world now. I don't know. Something about that phrase that just kind of makes me giggle. I don't know why.
If someone give me a TV remote, turn this off.
Oh my gosh.
Now, I do not blame Julian. If someone did this to my mom, I'd probably say you're in my world now too. I don't know what I would say. I'd go over to that screen and rip it off. Yeah. So 100% Julian's anger and protectiveness and concern is honorable and understandable. I get it. I get it. Because the way that it, earlier in the season when Julian was very much against it, so let me delineate. So at the beginning of the season when Julian was against it, I don't think any of that was justified. The way that he was talking to Debbie was disrespectful to Debbie, was putting her down. There wasn't any clear indication as to Oussama not being on the up and up. And there still is a possibility, I think a pretty distinct possibility, that at the time in the beginning, maybe, like I said, a 60-40 thing. He wanted to go to the U.S. 60%, and 40% of his motivation towards Debbie was because he loved her. But I don't think it was completely without some love, some genuineness there. I think it's possible that, again, he's just so awkward, but also he's just so desperate to get to the States. I think he has a fantasy. I think he really needs it to be true that he's going to have this wonderful life in the United States. I don't think I've thought about this, but I wouldn't be surprised if Oussama has hated himself his entire life and his life. And he has built up this fantasy, and some people on the show will do this, that if they can just get to the United States, everything will be better, their life will be better. And people, even in the United States, will do this. I know people in my neck of the woods that, due to their depression or their mistreatment growing up, they have this fantasy about living in another country or another part of this country as solving all their problems. I've treated people like this where they have chronic self-esteem or chronic depression or chronic issues, and they will just, whenever they are upset, they just start fantasizing about moving, and about they have these visions of living in Switzerland or in Argentina or in whatever, these magical places, because, if you pay attention to the travel videos and the stories, movies and TV shows, it can look really idyllic, right? In the same way, people can think about that about the United States. And so you really hold on. The one time in my life where I had a similar need was when I was in my master's program in my mid-20s. And I was very stressed out. I was going into debt. I was in over my head with graduate studies. I didn't really know as much as my fellow students. I felt very much out of my element as a jock frat guy, and suddenly I'm in this therapy program with all these other emotionally social justice oriented people. And of course, I was also social justice oriented, but not to the extent that they were, and because I had yet to really learn a lot of things. And so I'm really stressed out, overworked. Being a therapist, going to graduate school can be stressful, but there's something particular about going to graduate school to be a counselor or a therapist, psychologist, because it's not just all the academic work, which of course is difficult, but it's also your personhood goes through so many changes and is on such display. So much of who you are deep down, not only your prejudices and your biases and your counter-transference, but your family of origin, your psychological issues. Often you're in therapy the whole time. You should be anyway. And not only that, but just as a therapist, when you show up in the room, it's you, right? Other sorts of professions, it's not you. It's not your whole personhood, everything about you, your identities, your childhood, your culture, your way, the way you talk, the vibe that you give off, how comfortable you make other people feel. Like everything is on trial and under scrutiny. And of course, you feel like an imposter. And so it's a very trying time. And I had that during my master's. When I later went back and got another master's and a doctorate, it wasn't so much that way because I had progressed in the field in confidence. But during my master's in my mid-20s, it was very difficult for me, and I was very stressed out. And so I had this fantasy of becoming a monk and selling all my possessions, because it was also mid-20s was a time when I started actually. There's a scene in Fight Club where he's sitting on the toilet, Edward Norton, and he's like looking at an IKEA catalog or something, and he's imagining the perfect coffee table with the couch. And, I was kind of entering that zone. I certainly probably couldn't afford IKEA. I was still going to secondhand stores and buying, $50 couches. But it was around that time when you start thinking, oh, maybe I should start thinking about becoming an adult where you have dinner parties and you decorate your house to make it look at least kind of nice, and you floss your teeth and you wash your bathroom. I mean, literally, those are things that I was thinking about that I was not thinking about prior. And it's just, it was a lot. And I just wanted to just throw it all away. I just wanted to be like, I want to sell all my possessions. I want to live in the mountains somewhere in a cave. I just want to wake up in the morning and not have any obligations. That was another thing, as you start to become more of a responsible adult, you realize there are just so many obligations and responsibilities that you have, so many bills. And you go into debts and you're like, oh crap, I got to pay that. And I got to make sure I do this. It's overwhelming. And I wanted to escape it all. And so when I was stressed, I would have this fantasy, and it was I mostly knew it was a fantasy and just that, but there was a part of me I was like, well, maybe that is the right move. And I've had people email to me and tell me that they had the exact same or very similar kind of stress fantasy, if you will, of becoming a monk. And one person emailed me and said they actually did become a monk. They went to Southeast Asia, I believe, and from the States, and actually did join a monastery and became a monk of some sort. And they said it was terrible. So I think the practical fantasy for me was joining a Buddhist monastery in Seattle. There are those. And I thought, I didn't know what it would be like to live there, but I imagined maybe there would be some kind of option. And I would wear the same outfit every day. I wouldn't own anything. I wouldn't have any obligations, really. I would just serve and help people with, my hands. I would, make things or fix things or something. I just wouldn't have to think. I wouldn't have to perform. And so my whole point here is that I think for Oussama, he seemingly might have that issue where he is in chronic stress, maybe even specifically around growing up, right? and he doesn't know what to do, and he doesn't feel competent. He doesn't feel like he has options, and maybe the economy in his community doesn't lend itself to giving any sort of options, and he's always felt like an outsider. We could imagine him feeling that way, and he needs to have a fantasy to escape to in his mind, and he needs it so much and so badly and so chronically that he'll do anything to get there, including convincing himself that he's in love with a 65-year-old woman, you know what I mean? Maybe he literally believed it, or hard to know. So anyway, but yeah, I get Julian's anger. All right, well, if you didn't know, we have merch. You can click on the link below, I think, and find that. You can also find me on Cameo if you want to give someone a happy birthday or something like that. And everyone, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.